Daniel Harper's cabin sat at the edge of a quiet forest, where the tall pine trees whispered secrets to the wind and the world seemed to move at a slower, gentler pace. It wasn't the kind of place people stumbled upon by accident. You had to know it was the roar, be truly lost, to find it. Every morning, Daniel woke before the sun had fully stretched across the sky. His routine never changed. He would step outside onto the creaky wooden porch, breathe in the crisp air, and listen. Birds chirped softly, leaves rustled, and somewhere in the distance, a stream hummed its endless song. These were the sounds that filled his life. Now, once, there had been laughter in that cabin. Once, there had been another voice, but that was a long time ago. Daniel moved through his days with quiet purpose. He chopped wood with steady rhythm, each strike of the axe echoing through the trees. He tended to his small garden, carefully watering rows of vegetables that grew despite the rocky soil. He fixed things when they broke, cooked simple meals, and spoke only when necessary, usually to himself, though even that had become rare. The townsfolk a few miles down the dusty road knew of him. They called him the quiet man in the woods. Some said he had always been that way. Others whispered that something had changed him, but no one asked directly. In small towns, people respected silence as much as they respected truth. Once a week, Daniel would drive into town in his old pickup truck. He kept his interactions brief, just enough to buy supplies, nod politely at familiar faces, and leave before conversations could grow too long. It wasn't that he disliked people, he simply didn't know what to say anymore. Words felt heavy now. Back at the cabin, the hours stretched long, but never unbearable. Daniel had grown used to the solitude. In fact, he depended on it. The quiet gave him space to think core sometimes, not to think at all. As evening approached each day, he followed the same ritual. He gathered a few logs, stacked them carefully in the fireplace, and struck a match. The fire would catch slowly, at first, flickering hesitantly, before growing stronger, brighter. Soon, warm light filled the cabin, dancing across the wooden walls. And then, the smoke would rise. It curled its way out of the chimney, drifting into the fading sky like a silent signal. To anyone passing far off in the distance, it was proof that someone lived there, that the cabin wasn't abandoned. That life still existed in that quiet corner of the world. To Daniel, it meant something else. It meant he had made it through. Another day, sometimes, he would sit by the fire long after the flames had settled into glowing embers. He would stare into them, as if searching for something, perhaps a memory, perhaps a feeling he couldn't quite name. There were moments when the past crept in quietly, uninvited but familiar. A laugh echoing in his mind. A fleeting image of someone standing in the doorway, sunlight in their hair. A warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. But Daniel had learned how to let those moments pass. He didn't chase them, and he didn't fight them. He simply let them come and go, like the wind through the trees. Night would eventually settle over the forest, wrapping the cabin in darkness. The stars above shone bright and endless, untouched by city lights. Daniel would step outside once more before bed, glancing up at the sky, then back at the thin stream of smoke still rising from his chimney. It was a small thing, that smoke, but it was steady, reliable, just like him. Or at least, that's what he believed. Because in a life built on quiet routines and carefully guarded solitude, Daniel Harper had convinced himself of one simple truth. Nothing ever changed out here. The forest remained the same. The cabin stood untouched. And the smoke would always rise, just as it had the day before. And the day before that, but sometimes, the smallest signs, the faintest changes, were the ones that mattered most. Daniel just didn't know it yet. The road back to Daniel Harper's cabin stretched long and quiet, just as it always did. His old pickup truck rumbled steadily over the uneven dirt path, tires crunching against gravel and fallen leaves. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor. It was his usual time to return just before dusk, just before the cold began to settle in. Everything felt normal until it didn't. Daniel's eyes lifted instinctively toward the clearing ahead, where his cabin stood nestled between the pines. It was something he always did, a quiet habit, checking for that familiar stillness, that unchanged picture of solitude waiting for him. But today, something was different. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. A faint gray thread rose into the evening sky, barely visible against the fading blue. He blinked, slowing the truck as his grip tightened on the steering wheel. Smoke. His heart gave a slow, heavy thud. That wasn't possible. He hadn't lit the fire that morning. He was certain of it. Daniel was a careful man. Routine was everything. And fire was never something he left unattended. Never. The truck rolled to a stop a short distance from the cabin. For a moment, he just sat there, staring. The thin stream of smoke curled upward from his chimney, steady and undeniable. Someone was inside. A dozen thoughts rushed through his mind all at once. None of them clear, all of them sharp. Had someone broken in? Was it a traveler? Or worse, someone looking to take advantage of a man who lived alone, far from help? The forest, once comforting, now felt too quiet. Daniel reached over to the passenger seat, his hand hovering for a second before settling on the old wooden-handled tool he kept. There, it wasn't much, but it gave him something to hold on to. Something solid in the middle of the uncertainty. He stepped out of the truck slowly, closing the door with a soft click that seemed far louder than usual. The cool air brushed against his face, but he barely noticed. His attention was fixed entirely on the cabin. The smoke continued to rise, calm and unhurried, as if nothing at all was wrong. Daniel approached carefully, each step measured. The wooden boards of the porch creaked under his weight as he climbed up, the familiar sound now carrying an edge of tension. He paused at the door, listening. There it was, a faint sound from inside. Not loud, not threatening, just movement. His grip tightened slightly. For a brief moment, he considered turning, back driving into town, finding someone. Not facing this alone. But that wasn't who he was. This was his home. Taking a slow breath, Daniel reached for the doorknob. It turned easily under his hand, unlocked another detail that didn't sit right. He pushed the door open, just enough to see inside. Warm light spilled out to meet him, flickering softly against the wooden walls. The fire in the fireplace was already burning, its glow filling the room with a quiet, steady warmth. And there someone was there, seated near the fire, as though they belonged, as though this place was theirs, just as much as his. Daniel froze. In the doorway, his thoughts scattering for just a second as reality caught up with him. The figure didn't move right away. Instead, they seemed almost at ease. Then, slowly, the stranger turned. Their eyes met his. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick with uncertainty, but not with danger. There was no sudden movement, no sign of threat, just surprise. Quiet surprise. Daniel's heartbeat, which had been racing moments before, slowed just enough for him to think clearly again. This wasn't what he expected, not even close. The fire crackled softly between them, filling the space with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the tension hanging in the air. And then, finally, the stranger spoke. A simple voice, calm but careful. Not an apology, not an explanation. Just the beginning of something Daniel could never have predicted. Because, in all his years of living alone, in all the long, quiet days that had blurred into one another, no one had ever been waiting for him inside. And as he stood there, halfway between the life he knew and the unknown now sitting in his home, Daniel realized something had already changed. The smoke rising from his chimney that evening wasn't just a sign of life. It was a sign that his solitude had been quietly, unexpectedly broken. The evening settled gently over the cabin, wrapping the forest in a soft, golden hush. The last light of the sun filtered through the trees, fading slowly as the sky deepened into shades of blue and gray. Inside, the fire had already been lit, its steady glow casting warmth across the wooden walls. Daniel Harper stood near the window, his gaze resting on the familiar line of trees beyond the clearing. The day had been quiet again. Work in the garden, small repairs, the kind of steady rhythm he had always known. But now, even the quiet felt different. Behind him, Elisa moved softly around the cabin, her presence as natural as the firelight itself. She had fallen into the flow of the place with ease, helping without being asked, speaking when it mattered, leaving silence where it belonged. It no longer felt like she was visiting. It felt like she was part of it. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if recognizing something he hadn't fully allowed himself to name yet. This place suits you, Eliza said gently from behind him. He turned slightly. You think so? She smiled faintly. It's calm, honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything. It's not. Daniel glanced around the cabin, the worn wood, the simple furniture, the life he had built piece by piece. Not much to it, he said. Eliza shook her head. There's more here than you realize. Her words lingered in the air, but this time, there was something else beneath them. Something quieter, something uncertain. Daniel noticed. You've been thinking about something? He said. Eliza hesitated. For the first time since she had arrived, her calm seemed to waver just slightly. She moved closer to the fire, her hands resting lightly on the back of the chair. I can't stay forever, she said. The words were soft, but they carried weight. Daniel felt them immediately, though he didn't show it. I didn't expect you to, he replied, keeping his tone steady. Eliza nodded, her eyes focused on the fire. I've been moving for so long, it's just what I do. I don't usually stop. There was a pause. With this place, she continued, her voice quieter now, it feels different. Daniel didn't interrupt. It feels like I could stay, she admitted, and that's what scares me. The honesty in her words settled deeply between them. Daniel stepped closer, leaning lightly against the table. Why would that scare you? Elisa let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh. Because staying means trusting something won't disappear, and I'm not sure I've ever been good at that. Daniel understood that more than he expected. For years, he had done the opposite. He had stayed, but he had stopped trusting anything new. He had built walls out of routine and silence, convincing himself that nothing would change if he didn't let it. And now here she was, standing in the middle of that carefully built life, asking a question neither of them had planned to face. Eliza finally looked at him. I don't want to overstep, she said. You were doing just fine before I showed up. Daniel considered that for a moment. Was he? The question felt heavier than it should have. I was existent, he said slowly. Eliza's expression softened. Daniel looked toward the fire, then back at her. But things are different now. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. You don't feel like a burden, he added, if that's what you're worried about. Eliza lowered her gaze slightly. I just don't want to take something that isn't mine. Daniel shook his head. That's not how this feels. Another silence followed, but this one was different as it wasn't uncertain, that it was honest. Eliza stepped closer, just enough that the space between them no longer felt distant. What if I stay, and it doesn't last? She asked quietly. Daniel met her eyes. For a long time he had avoided questions like that, anything that carried risk, anything that could lead to loss, again. But now, the answer came without hesitation. Then at least it was real while it did, he said. Eliza held his gaze, searching for doubt. But there wasn't any. Only truth. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the room as the weight of that moment settled into something steady. Not rushed, not forced, just Claire. Eliza nodded slowly, as if accepting something within herself. I don't know what comes next, she admitted. Daniel gave a small, understanding nod. Neither do I. And for once that didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something to step into. Together. Outside. The night had fully arrived. The stars stretching endlessly across the sky. The chimney released a thin line of smoke into the darkness, steady and sure. Inside, the cabin no longer felt like a place caught in the past. It felt like something beginning, and as Eliza stood there, no longer just a stranger passing through, Daniel realized that the choice ahead of them wasn't about leaving or staying, it was about belonging. And for the first time in a long while, that choice didn't feel so impossible. Morning came quietly once again, but this time it carried something new. The light that filtered through the cabin windows felt warmer, softer somehow, as if even the sun had noticed the change. Outside, the forest moved with its usual rhythm, branches swaying gently, birds calling into the open sky, the distant stream continuing its steady song. But inside the cabin, nothing felt the same as it once had. Daniel Harper stood near the fireplace, placing another log onto the embers. The fire caught easily, flames rising with a calm familiarity. He watched it for a moment, then glanced toward the table. 2 cups, 2 chairs, slightly pulled out, 2 lives, quietly sharing the same space. Behind him, Eliza stepped out from the small bedroom, her movements unhurried. There was no hesitation in the way she walked through the cabin, now no uncertainty about where she belonged, no careful distance between her and the life around her. She had chosen to stay, not out of necessity, not out of fear, but because, for the first time in a long while, she wanted to. Smells like morning already started without me, she said with a soft smile. Daniel glanced over, a faint smile forming in return. You were sleeping. Didn't want to wake you. Eliza moved closer, resting her hands lightly on the back of the chair. I think I'm getting used to this place. You think? Daniel asked. She nodded. Yeah. A small pause followed before she added, it feels like home. The word lingered in the air. Home. For Daniel, it had always been tied to memory, to what once was, to something he thought he had lost for good. But now, standing there, with the fire warming the room, and someone beside him who understood both silence and presence, the meaning of that word had shifted. Yeah, he said quietly. It does. They shared a simple breakfast, just like the day before. But even that felt fuller somehow. Conversation came easily now, not forced, not carefully measured. It flowed in small moments, shared glances, quiet jokes, the comfort of knowing someone else was there. Afterward, they stepped outside together. The air was cool, but not cold. The sky stretched wide above them, clear and endless. Daniel walked toward the woodpile, while Eliza followed, picking up a few scattered pieces along the way without being asked. It wasn't about helping anymore, it was just what they did. You know, Eliza said, brushing her hands together, I used to think I had to keep moving to find where I belonged. Daniel split a piece of wood, setting it aside before replying, and now, she looked around the cabin. The trees, the the quiet space that no longer felt empty. Now I think, maybe, I just had to stop long enough to see it. Daniel considered that, leaning the axe gently against the stump. Funny, he said. I spent years staying in one place, thinking nothing would ever change. Eliza smiled softly, and then it did. Yeah, admitted. They stood there for a moment, side by side, the silence between them no longer something to fill but something to share. As the day moved forward, they worked together, moving through the rhythm of the cabin as though it had always been this way. The small tasks, the quiet routines, the steady pace of life in the forest, it all felt natural, balanced, complete. By evening, the sky once again began to fade, the soft glow of sunset settling over the treetops. Daniel returned inside and lit the fire, just as he always had. But this time, when the flames rose and the smoke began to curl its way up the chimney, it meant something more. Eliza joined him near the window, her gaze following the thin trail of smoke as it disappeared into the darkening sky. That used to be your signal, didn't it? She asked. Daniel nodded. Yeah, that you made it through the day? He looked at her, then back at the fire. It still is, he said. Just, not in the same way. Eliza leaned slightly closer, her voice soft. What does it mean now? Daniel watched the flames for a moment longer before answering. It means there's someone here to share it with. Eliza's expression warmed, her smile quiet but certain. Outside, the forest settled into night once more. The stars appeared, scattered across the sky like distant lights guiding the dark. And from the chimney, the smoke continued to rise steady, unwavering, but no longer a sign of loneliness. No longer just a mark of survival. Now, it was a symbol of something stronger, something rebuilt, something found again in the most unexpected way, home. And as Daniel stood there beside Eliza, watching the fire they now shared, he understood a truth he had once thought impossible. Sometimes, the life you believe is over, is only waiting for the right person to help you begin again. Morning came softly to the cabin, as it always did. A pale golden light filtered through the tall pines, slipping between branches and resting gently against the windows. The forest stirred awake, birds calling to one another, leaves rustling. In the early breeze, the distant murmur of the stream continuing its quiet song. For years, Daniel Harper had woken to this same rhythm alone. But today, something was different. He noticed it before he even opened his eyes. There was another presence in the cabin. Not loud, not intrusive, just there. Subtle, steady, real. Daniel sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair as he adjusted to the morning light. For a brief second, he wondered if the night before had been a dream. It wouldn't have been the first time his mind had wandered into memories that felt almost real. But then, a soft sound reached him from the other room. Movement. He stood, stepping quietly across the wooden floor. As he reached the doorway, he paused. Eliza was already awake. She stood near the small kitchen table, carefully arranging a few things as things, with a kind of gentle respect, as though she understood they carried meaning. A kettle rested near the fire, steam just beginning to rise again. She turned when she sensed him. "Oh, good morning," she said, offering a small, almost shy smile. Daniel nodded. "You're up early." Eliza glanced toward the window. Couldn't really sleep much after a while. Not used to. Walls, I guess. There was no complaint in her voice, just honesty. Daniel stepped further into the room, noticing the subtle changes. The space looked lighter somehow, not different in structure but in feeling. The table was cleared more neatly than usual. A few small things had been adjusted, not moved drastically, just enough to feel cared for. He didn't have to do anything, he said. "I know," Eliza replied. "I just wanted to help." There was something in the way she said it. Not obligation, not repayment. Just a quiet desire to be useful. Daniel studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. All right. It wasn't resistance. It was acceptance. They shared a simple breakfast bread, a bit of fruit, and the same warm tea from the night before. The conversation was light, mostly small observations about the morning, the forest, the weather. But even in the quiet, something had changed. The silence no longer felt empty. After they finished, Daniel reached for his coat. "I've got some work to do outside." Eliza stood as well. "Could I help?" The question caught him slightly off guard. For years, that answer had always been the same. There was no one to help. He hesitated, then nodded. "If you want it." Outside, the air was crisp and fresh. The sunlight had grown stronger, casting long beams through the trees. Daniel picked up his axe, moving toward the stack of wood that needed splitting. Eliza followed, watching for a moment before stepping closer. "Show me," she asked. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly, then handed her a smaller piece of wood. "You start like this," he said, demonstrating slowly. "Keep your grip steady." Elisa mimicked his movements carefully. Her first attempt was clumsy, the axe barely making an impression. She laughed softly at herself. Daniel didn't. Instead, he adjusted her stance slightly. Try again. This time, it landed better. Not perfect, but progress. They worked side by side, the steady rhythm of chopping wood echoing into the forest. Occasionally, Eliza would ask a question. Occasionally, Daniel would answer with more words than he usually allowed himself. Time passed differently that morning. Faster, lighter. Later, they moved to the garden. Eliza knelt beside the rows of vegetables, brushing her fingers lightly. Over to Lee's. You've taken good care of this, she said. Daniel shrugged. It keeps me busy. It's more than that, she replied. It's alive. He didn't respond, but he didn't disagree either. As the sun climbed higher, the cabin behind them stood quietly, smoke once again rising from the chimney. But now, it wasn't just a signal of survival. It felt like something more. Eliza stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. You've built something good here, she said. Daniel looked around the trees, the cabin, the small pieces of a life he had carefully maintained. For a long time, he had thought of it as enough. Now, he wasn't so sure. It's just what I had, he said. Eliza shook her head gently. No, she said. It's what you kept going. That stayed with him. Because for the first time in years, Daniel realized something he hadn't allowed himself to see before. This life he had built didn't have to stay the same forever. And as he glanced toward Eliza standing there in the sunlight, bringing quiet energy into a place that had long stood still, he understood something even more surprising. Change didn't always come like a storm. Sometimes, it arrived quietly, with the morning light. And sometimes, it stayed. The drive into town felt different that morning. Daniel Harper noticed it the moment he turned the key in his old pickup truck. It wasn't the road, it was the same uneven path, the same curve around the tall pines, the same long stretch of quiet dust leading toward the small town miles away. It wasn't the weather either. The sky was clear, the air crisp, just like countless mornings before. No, it's something else, or rather, someone else. Eliza sat beside him. She watched the passing trees with quiet interest, her gaze shifting from one detail to another as though everything held meaning. To her, this wasn't routine. It was something new. To Daniel, it felt like stepping into a life he had long left behind. You don't come into town much, do you? Eliza asked gently. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. Once a week, sometimes, less. Eliza nodded. I figured. There was no judgment in her voice. Just observation. The truck rolled forward, tires kicking up light dust behind them. For a while, they drove in comfortable silence. Not the heavy silence Daniel was used to, but something easier. Something that didn't demand anything. As they approached the edge of town, the world began to shift. Small wooden buildings lined the main street. A general store stood at the center, its porch dotted with rocking chairs. A few people moved about their day talking, carrying supplies, greeting one another in passing. It was a simple place, familiar, and yet, as Daniel drove in with Eliza beside him, it felt like all eyes slowly began to turn. At first, it was subtle. A glance here, a pause there. Then came the recognition. That's Daniel Harper. Someone whispered, nod quietly enough. The quiet one? Yeah, but who's that with him? Daniel heard it. He always did. He pulled the truck to a stop near the general store, his hands resting on the wheel for just a moment. Longer than usual. He could feel it, that shift in attention, the curiosity hanging in the air. Eliza noticed it too. She leaned slightly closer, her voice low. They're not used to seeing you with company, are they? Daniel let out a quiet breath. No. She gave a small, understanding smile. Well, they'll get used to it. That simple confidence caught him off guard. For years, Daniel had shaped his life around avoiding moments like this, avoiding questions, attention, conversation, but now, stepping out of the truck with Eliza beside him, there was no avoiding it. And strangely, he didn't feel the need to. They walked toward the store together. The wooden steps creaked under their feet as they stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly, announcing their arrival. Inside, the familiar scent of wood, spices, and old shelves wrapped around them. Mrs. Carter, who ran the store, looked up from behind the counter. Her eyes widened just slightly. Daniel, she said, her voice warm but curious. Good to see you. He nodded. Morning. Her gaze shifted to Eliza, her curiosity gentle but unmistakable. And who might this be? Elisa stepped forward, easily, offering a polite smile. I'm Elisa. Mrs. Carter returned the smile, though her interest clearly deepened. Well, it's nice to meet you, Elisa. There was a brief pause, one of those small-town moments where questions linger, just beneath the surface. But Eliza didn't seem bothered. Neither, surprisingly, did Daniel. They moved through the store together, gathering supplies. This time, Daniel didn't rush. He didn't avoid eye contact or keep his head down. When someone greeted him, he responded. When someone made a passing comment, he didn't turn away. Eliza noticed. "You're different here," she said quietly, as they stood near one of the shelves. Daniel glanced at her. "How?" She tilted her head slightly. "Like you're remembering how to be part of things." The words settled deeper than he expected. Maybe she was right. Outside, as they loaded the truck, a few townspeople offered small nods, even brief smiles. The whispers had softened now, turning into quiet acceptance. Not questions, not suspicion. Just curiosity, giving way to something calmer. As Daniel closed the tailgate, he looked around the town, the same place he had visited for years. Always from a distance, always keeping himself apart. But today, it didn't feel so distant. It felt closer. Real again? He climbed back into the truck, Eliza settling into her seat beside him. As they drove away, the town slowly faded behind them, returning to its quiet rhythm. But something had changed. Not just in the town, in him. "You know," Eliza said, looking out at the road ahead, "they don't see you the way you think they do." Daniel kept driving. "No." She shook her head. "They just didn't know you." He considered that. For a long time, Daniel had believed his life was meant to stay small, quiet, untouched. But now, that belief didn't feel as certain. As the cabin came back into view, smoke already beginning to rise once more, Daniel realized something simple, but undeniable. The world he had stepped away from hadn't disappeared. It had just been waiting. And now, slowly. For a long moment, Daniel Harper stood frozen in the doorway, his hands still resting on the edge of the half-open door. The warm glow of the fire stretched across the cabin floor, reaching toward him like an invitation he wasn't sure he should accept. The stranger sat near the fireplace, her posture calm but alert now, as if she had been expecting this moment. The flickering flames painted soft shadows across her face, revealing tired eyes and a quiet kind of strength beneath them. She was the first to break the silence. "I'm sorry," she said gently, her voice steady but not defensive. "I didn't mean to scare you." Daniel didn't respond right away. His gaze moved briefly around the room, taking everything into firewood stacked neatly. The kettle placed carefully near the flames. The chair she had chosen. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing looked stolen or broken, just used. "I thought the place was empty," she continued, her hands resting loosely in her lap. "I saw the cabin from the road, and it was getting cold. I just needed somewhere to warm up for a little while." Her words hung in the air, simple and honest. Daniel finally stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. The familiar creak echoed through the room, grounding him in a space that suddenly felt unfamiliar. "You lit the fire," he said, his voice low, more an observation than a question. She nodded. "I hope that's okay." "I didn't take much wood, just enough to keep the cold out." If it was a pause, Daniel set the tool he'd been holding down near the door, his movements slow and deliberate. He kept a careful distance, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. This situation didn't fit into the quiet structure of his life. It had no routine, no pattern. It was something entirely new. "What's your name?" he asked after a moment. "Eliza," she replied softly. The name seemed to settle into the room, as though it belonged there. "Daniel," he said, almost automatically. Eliza gave a small nod, acknowledging it. Up close, he could see the signs of her journey. Dust clung lightly to the edges of her clothing, and her boots were worn from long miles. There was a faint weariness in her posture, the kind that didn't come from a single hard day but from many. "You've been traveling?" Daniel said. "Yes," she answered. "For a while now." He studied her for a moment longer, searching for something, perhaps a reason not to trust her, perhaps a reason to ask her to leave, but he didn't find either. Instead, he noticed something else. She looked relieved, not triumphant, not sneaky, just someone who had finally found a moment to rest. "You couldn't have taken anything," Daniel said quietly. "There's no one around here to stop you." Eliza shook her head immediately. "That's not why I came in." Her tone wasn't defensive, it was certain. "I don't want anything that isn't mine," she added. "I just needed warmth. Just for a little while." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence that followed. Daniel moved a few steps closer, though he still kept space between them. He crouched near the hearth, adjusting one of the logs slightly, more out of habit than necessity. The flames responded instantly, growing brighter. "You were cold," he said. Eliza gave a faint smile, the first hint of something lighter in her expression. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. This wasn't what he had expected to find when he saw the smoke. Not a threat, not trouble, just a person. A stranger. Yes, but not one who seemed to carry harm with her. "You could stay until it's warmer outside?" he said, the words leaving him before he had fully thought them through. Eliza looked at him, surprised. "Are you sure?" He hesitated, just for a second. Then he nodded. It gets colder after dark, he said simply. No point going back out in that. Her expression softened, something unspoken passing through her eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief, too deep for words. Thank you, she said quietly. Daniel gave a small nod in return and stood, moving toward the small kitchen area. He reached for a second cup without thinking, setting it beside the kettle that was already beginning to hum softly from the heat of the fire. It had been a long time since he'd needed to dot behind him. Eliza remained by the fire, her hands held out toward the warmth. But now, there was something different in the room, something subtle. The cabin no longer felt like a place frozen in time. It felt shared, not fully, not yet, but enough to shift something deep within Daniel, feeling he hadn't allowed himself to recognize in years. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy, and as the firelight flickered between them, Daniel realized that the stranger sitting in his home hadn't just stepped into his cabin. She had stepped into his life. And whether he understood it or not, things would never be quite the same again. The fire burned steadily, filling the cabin with a gentle warmth that softened the edges of the cold night outside. The wind had begun to move through the trees again, brushing against the walls with a quiet whisper. But inside, everything felt still. Different. Daniel placed 2 cups on the small wooden table, pouring hot water carefully as the kettle let out a soft sigh. He added a bit of dried herbs to each, something simple he'd grown himself. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. He slid 1 cup across the table, toward Eliza. She hesitated for just a moment, as if unsure whether she should accept it. Then reached forward and wrapped her hands around the warmth. Her fingers lingered there, soaking it in. Thank you, she said again. Softer this time. Daniel nodded and sat across from her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortably, it just felt unfamiliar, like something waiting to be understood. Eliza took a small sip, her shoulders relaxing slightly. This is good. It's nothing special, Daniel replied. She shook her head gently. It is when you haven't had anything warm all day. That simple sentence carried more weight than it seemed. Daniel looked at her a little more closely, now, noticing the tiredness in her eyes again, the quiet strength holding it all together. You've been on your own, he said. Eliza nodded slowly. For a long time, there was a pause before she continued, as though choosing her words carefully. I used to have a home, she said. A real one. People, noise, laughter, all of it. A faint smile touched her lips, but it didn't last long. But things change. They always do. Daniel didn't interrupt. He understood that kind of change, the kind that doesn't ask permission. I lost them, she added quietly. Not all at once, just over time, one by one, until there was no one left who felt like home anymore. The words settled between them, heavy but honest. Daniel looked down at his cup, turning it slightly in his hands. For years, he had kept his own story locked away, untouched and unspoken. It was easier that way, safer. But something about the way Eliza spoke, calm, open, without trying to hide the truth, made it harder to stay silent. I had a wife, he said, his voice low. The words felt unfamiliar, like something from another life. Eliza didn't react with surprise. She simply listened. She loved this place, Daniel continued. Said the quiet made everything clearer. Said it felt like we had our own world out here. A faint smile crossed his face, but like Eliza's, it carried a hint of sadness. He used to sit right there, he said, glancing toward the chair by the window. Every morning, watching the trees like they had something to say. Eliza followed his gaze, as if trying to picture it. What happened? She asked gently. Daniel took a breath, slow and steady. She got sick, he said, and then she was gone. There was no need for more detail. The simplicity of it said everything. The fire cracked softly, filling the silence that followed. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the cabin walls like a distant echo. I'm sorry, Eliza said. Daniel nodded once. It was a long time ago, but even as he said it, something in his tone revealed the truth. Time hadn't changed everything. Some things stayed exactly the same. Eliza looked down at her cup, tracing the rim lightly with her finger. Funny how a place can feel so full one moment and completely empty the next. Daniel glanced at her. Yeah? They sat there quietly, 2 strangers bound by stories they had never planned to share. Different lives, different paths, but somehow, the same kind of loneliness. I didn't mean to come in and disturb anything, Eliza said after a moment. If you want me to leave in the morning, I will. Daniel leaned back slightly, considering her words. The cabin had been his world for years. Quiet, controlled, unchanged. But tonight, something had shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, just enough to be noticed. You didn't disturb anything, he said. Eliza looked up at him, uncertain. Daniel met her gaze, his expression steady. "You just changed it a little." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Eliza smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And somehow, in that quiet cabin surrounded by endless forest, it felt like the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them might have needed all along.